Sometimes when you've lost everything, life gives you exactly what you need. There are moments when two broken souls find each other and discover they're not broken at all. Tom Harlan stood at that dusty auction with his last $2, watching folks laugh at a starving donkey with a sack over its head. Nobody wanted the poor creature. But Tom saw something different. He raised his hand and bought that donkey. The crowd thought he was crazy. What they didn't know was that this simple act of kindness would save them all. But what was hidden under that sack that made everyone turn away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust never settled in Drywell, Texas. It hung in the air like a permanent reminder that 1894 had been the driest year anyone could remember, and 1895 wasn't shaping up much better. The town squatted on the prairie like a collection of weathered bones, its buildings bleached grey by the relentless sun and scoured by winds that carried more grit than hope. Tom Harlan walked slowly down Main Street, his father's worn spurs jingling softly with each step. The spurs were silver once, handed down from his grandfather who'd fought at San Jacinto. But now they were tarnished and dented, much like Tom's prospects. He kept them polished out of respect, though some days he wondered if his father would be proud or ashamed of what his son had become. The boarding house sat at the end of the street, like a tired old woman settling into her chair. Martha Weatherby had painted it yellow once, but the color had faded to the shade of old bones. Tom climbed the front steps, each board creaking under his boots, and pushed through the screen door that never quite closed right. "Tom?" Martha's voice carried from the kitchen, warm despite the circumstances. "That you?" "Yes, ma'am." He hung his hat on the peg by the door and ran his fingers through hair that needed cutting. At 32, Tom still had the build of a working man, but his shoulders carried the weight of too many failures. Martha appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was 45 and handsome in the way of women who'd learned that beauty came from kindness rather than youth. Her dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and her eyes held the particular warmth of someone who'd known sorrow but refused to let it make her bitter. "Any luck today?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Tom shook his head. "Harrison's outfit isn't hiring. Neither is the railroad. Seems like everybody's cutting back, not taking on." Martha's expression softened with sympathy. "Sit down. I'll get you some coffee." The boarding house kitchen was the heart of the place, with its large wooden table scarred by years of use and a cast-iron stove that Martha kept burning even in summer. Tom settled into his usual chair and watched her pour coffee from the blue enamel pot. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been caring for others most of her life. "You know," she said, setting the cup before him, "I've been thinking about what you said about going to California." Tom wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "Might be time. There's talk of gold up in Alaska too. Man could start fresh. Is that what you want? To start fresh somewhere else?" The question hung between them like smoke. Tom had been asking himself the same thing for months. After losing the family ranch 2 years ago, his father's ranch, his grandfather's ranch, he'd drifted from job to job, town to town, always looking for something that felt like home again. "I don't rightly know anymore," he admitted. "Used to think I knew exactly what I wanted. Ranch of my own, cattle, maybe a family someday. Now it seems like I'm just getting by, day to day." Martha sat across from him, her own cup in hand. "Your father's ranch wasn't meant to be mine, apparently." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "Drought took the cattle. Bank took the land. Simple as that. Your father would be proud of how you've handled it," Martha said quietly. "Not many men would have worked as hard as you have to pay off his debts." Tom looked at her over his coffee. Martha had a way of seeing the good in situations that seemed hopeless. It was one of the things he'd come to admire about her during his 6 months at the boarding house. "What about you?" he asked. Ever think about starting fresh somewhere? A shadow passed across her features. This place is all I have left of Daniel. He built it with his own hands, you know. Every board, every nail. I can't just walk away from that. Her husband had died 3 years ago, leaving her with the boarding house and not much else. Tom knew the feeling of being tied to a place by memories, both good and painful. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted their conversation. Sheriff Coleman pushed through the door, removing his hat as he entered. He was a big man with graying hair and the careful movements of someone who'd learned that most problems could be solved with patience rather than force. "Martha, Tom," he nodded to each of them. "Mind if I sit a spell?" "Of course, Ray. Coffee?" "Much obliged." Coleman settled his bulk into a chair that protested under his weight. "Tom, I heard you were at the livestock auction today." "Yes, sir. Looking for work mostly, but didn't find any." Coleman accepted his coffee with a grateful nod. "Heard you made a purchase, though." Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Dry Well. $2. Seemed like the right thing to do. For a donkey with a sack over its head. Coleman's tone wasn't mocking, just curious. "Folks are saying you've lost your mind." "Folks say a lot of things." Tom's jaw tightened. "Most of it's not worth repeating." Martha looked between the two men with growing interest. "What donkey?" Tom sighed, knowing the story would come out whether he told it or not. "There was a donkey at the auction today, thin as a rail, sickly looking. Someone had tied a burlap sack over its head. Nobody wanted it." "Why would someone cover its head?" Martha asked. "That's what I wondered." Tom stood and walked to the window, looking out at the small stable behind the boarding house where he'd left the animal. "Figured I'd find out." Coleman leaned back in his chair. "And did you?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. "She's blind in one eye, cloudy, like a cataract. I reckon whoever owned her thought folks wouldn't bid if they saw it." "Blind?" Martha's voice carried a note of concern. "Poor thing." "She gets around fine," Tom said quickly. "Better than fine, actually. It's like she hears things the rest of us miss. When I was walking her back here, she stopped dead in her tracks right before a rattler crossed the path. Saved us both from a nasty surprise." Coleman raised an eyebrows. "Interesting. What are you planning to do with her?" Tom turned from the window. "Haven't decided yet. She needs feeding up, that's certain. After that," he shrugged, "we'll see." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hayes, the town's physician and one of the few men in Dry Well with a formal education. He was thin and precise, with silver hair and the careful speech of someone who'd grown up back east. "Good evening, everyone." Hayes hung his black bag by the door. "Martha, I hope you don't mind my stopping by so late." "Not at all, Doctor. Coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." Hayes took the remaining chair at the table. "I couldn't help but hear about your acquisition today, Tom. Quite the topic of conversation around town." Tom returned to his seat, feeling like he was being surrounded. "Seems like folks don't have enough to worry about if they're spending time talking about one old donkey." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong," Hayes said, accepting his coffee from Martha. "In a community like ours, every decision affects everyone else in some way. Your act of kindness today, and it was kind, make no mistake, says something about the character of our town. How do you figure?" Hayes sipped his coffee thoughtfully. There were 37 people at that auction today. 36 of them saw that animal as worthless, something to be mocked. Only one saw something worth saving. That says something hopeful about human nature, don't you think? Coleman nodded slowly. "Doc's got a point. Times like these, it's easy to get hard. Stop seeing the good in things." Martha had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "I'd like to see her." "The donkey." Tom looked at her with surprise. "She's nothing much to look at. I suspect she's exactly what she needs to be," Martha replied with a gentle smile. They made their way outside, the four of them walking across the small yard to the stable behind the boarding house. Tom had built a temporary stall using old lumber and rope, nothing fancy but dry and secure. The donkey stood in the back corner, her head lowered as she worked her way through a pile of hay Tom had purchased with his last 50 cents. She was small for a donkey, probably no more than 10 hands high, with a coat that had once been grey but now showed patches of brown and white where malnutrition had taken its toll. Her ribs showed clearly, and her hip bones stood out like mountain peaks. But it was her eye that drew attention, the good one, dark brown and alert, that seemed to take in everything around her with quiet intelligence. "Hello, girl," Martha said softly, extending her hand palm up. The donkey looked up from her hay, ears swiveling forward with interest. "I wouldn't," Tom started, but the donkey was already moving toward Martha, her small hooves making soft sounds in the straw. She sniffed Martha's hand carefully, then allowed herself to be touched. "She's gentle," Martha observed, stroking the donkey's neck. "Seems to be," Tom agreed. "Haven't seen any meanness in her." Dr. Hayes moved closer, his professional eye taking in the animal's condition. "She's been neglected, certainly, but I don't see any signs of abuse. The blindness appears to be congenital. She was probably born with it, which explains the sack," Coleman said grimly. "Someone was trying to hide it so they could get more money." Tom felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of anyone treating an animal so callously. The donkey seemed to sense his mood and moved closer to him, pressing her muzzle against his arm. "What will you call her?" Martha asked. Tom hadn't given it much thought, but looking at the animal now, one name seemed to fit. "Hope," he said. "I think I'll call her Hope," Coleman chuckled. "Hope, huh? Think she'll live up to it?" Tom looked down at the small donkey, who was now nuzzling his pocket in search of treats he didn't have. Despite her condition, despite the mockery of the townspeople, despite his own uncertain future, something about her steadfast presence made him feel less alone. "I think," he said quietly, "we might be good for each other." As the evening settled over Dry Well and the others returned to their own concerns, Tom remained in the stable with Hope. He brushed her coat with gentle strokes, talking to her in the low, soothing voice his father had used with horses. She stood patiently for his ministrations, occasionally turning her good eye to watch him work. For the first time in months, Tom Harlan felt like he had a purpose beyond mere survival. It wasn't much caring for one half-blind donkey, but it was something, and sometimes, when you'd lost everything else, something was enough to build on. The spurs on his boots caught the lamplight as he worked, their tarnished silver gleaming briefly before fading back into shadow. His father's legacy, worn now by a man who'd lost the family ranch but found something else worth protecting. It wasn't what anyone had expected, least of all Tom himself. But as Hope settled down in her bed of fresh straw, her breathing deep and peaceful for perhaps the first time in weeks, Tom began to think that maybe unexpected wasn't the same thing as wrong. 3 weeks later, Tom was beginning to believe that Hope might actually live up to her name. The little donkey had filled out considerably under his care, her ribs no longer showing quite so prominently, and her coat had taken on a healthier sheen. More importantly, she'd proven to be remarkably intelligent and surprisingly useful around the boarding house. It was Hope who'd alerted him to the loose board on the front porch that would have sent Martha tumbling down the steps. She'd refused to walk past it, braying softly and pawing at the ground until Tom investigated. It was Hope who detected the gas leak from the kitchen stove before anyone else smelled it, becoming agitated and pushing against Tom until he followed her inside to discover the problem. "That donkey's got better sense than most people," Martha had observed after the stove incident, and Tom was beginning to agree. On this particular Tuesday morning, Tom was mucking out Hope's stall when Martha appeared in the stable doorway. Her face was pale, and she clutched a piece of paper in her trembling hands. "Tom?" Her voice was smaller than usual, uncertain in a way that made his stomach tighten with dread. He set down his pitchfork and moved toward her. "What is it?" She held out the paper, official-looking, with the bank's letterhead at the top. Tom's heart sank before he even read the words. He'd seen too many of these documents in his own life not to recognize a foreclosure notice. 30 days, Martha whispered. They're giving me 30 days to pay what I owe, or they take the boarding house. Tom scanned the document, his jaw clenching as he read the details. The amount was substantial, more than the boarding house could earn in 6 months, even with every room filled. How much behind are you? $437. She sank onto a bale of hay, the fight seeming to go out of her all at once. Daniel always handled the finances. I never realized how far behind we'd gotten before he died. Tom crumpled the notice in his fist, anger flaring in his chest. It was the same story he'd lived through with his father's ranch. Good people crushed by circumstances beyond their control. Banks that cared more about numbers on paper than human lives. There has to be something we can do, he said. Some way to raise the money. Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. Where? I've already sold everything of value Daniel left me. The boarding house barely brings in enough to cover food and basic repairs. Hope had been watching their conversation with the attention she gave to everything around her. Now she moved closer to Martha, pressing her muzzle against the woman's shoulder in what seemed like an attempt at comfort. She knows you're upset, Tom observed. Martha reached up to stroke Hope's neck. Smart girl. Too bad she can't help us figure out how to save this place. Tom studied the little donkey thoughtfully. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd been amazed by Hope's abilities. Her hearing was extraordinary. She could detect approaching weather changes hours before they arrived, sense the mood of people around her, even locate lost objects by following trails invisible to human senses. Maybe she can, he said slowly. Martha looked up at him with confusion. What do you mean? Think about it. How many times has Hope warned us about something? The loose board, the gas leak, that rattlesnake on our way back from town yesterday. She's got senses the rest of us can only dream of. I don't understand where you're going with this. Tom began to pace, an idea forming in his mind. People are always getting lost out here on the prairie. Cattle wander off, travelers take wrong turns, folks get caught in weather they didn't see coming. What if we offered guide services? Hope could keep us safe, help us find people who need finding. Martha frowned. You want to charge people for Hope's abilities? Not charge them for Hope, Tom corrected. Charge them for safe passage through dangerous country. Hope just makes us better at it than anyone else. The idea was taking shape as he spoke. Drywell sat on several major cattle trails and the route to California. People passed through regularly, some with money, all with the need to reach their destinations safely. With Hope's extraordinary senses, Tom could offer something no other guide could, near certain safety in uncertain terrain. It could work, Martha said slowly, hope creeping into her voice. But 30 days, is that enough time to earn $400? Tom did quick calculations in his head. If he charged $5 per day for guide services, he'd need to work 80 days to earn the full amount. But if he could handle multiple jobs or charge premium rates for dangerous routes, it's worth trying, he said finally. What's the alternative? Martha's face crumpled slightly. Pack up and leave. Start over somewhere else, if I can figure out where. The thought of Martha losing the boarding house, her last connection to her late husband, made Tom's chest tighten. This place had become home to him in a way nowhere else had since losing the ranch. More than that, Martha had become important to him, though he hadn't quite admitted to himself how important. We're not going to let that happen, he said firmly. Hope seemed to sense the determination in his voice. She raised her head and made a soft sound, not quite a bray, more like a rumble of agreement. First thing we need to do is let people know we're available, Tom continued. I'll talk to Sheriff Coleman. Maybe put up notices in the general store and the saloon. What about equipment? If you're going to be guiding people across country, you'll need supplies. Tom thought about his meager savings, barely enough to buy a week's worth of provisions. I'll figure something out. Over the next few days, Tom threw himself into preparing for his new venture. He spoke to everyone in town about his guide services, emphasizing Hope's special abilities without making claims that sounded too far-fetched. Sheriff Coleman was supportive, mentioning several recent incidents where travelers had gotten lost or injured on unfamiliar trails. "Might be there's a real need for this," Coleman admitted. "Last month alone, we had to organize 3 search parties." Dr. Hayes was more skeptical. "Are you certain the animal's capabilities are as extraordinary as you believe? Sometimes we see what we want to see." Tom had wondered the same thing himself, but Hope continued to demonstrate abilities that defied explanation. Just that morning, she'd led him to a section of fence where cattle had broken through during the night, a break that was invisible from the house, but which Hope had somehow detected. The first real test came on a grey Wednesday morning, when a traveling salesman named Peterson approached Tom about guiding him to the next town. Peterson was nervous about reports of bandits on the main road and willing to pay extra for a safe route across country. $5, you said. Peterson mopped his brow with a handkerchief despite the cool weather. That seems steep for a day's work. "It's not just a day's work," Tom replied. "It's safe passage. I guarantee you'll reach Millerville without incident." Peterson looked skeptically at Hope, who was standing quietly nearby. "And you're basing this guarantee on that donkey?" "I'm basing it on knowledge of the terrain and years of experience," Tom said diplomatically. "Hope just helps me stay alert to things I might otherwise miss." In the end, Peterson agreed, primarily because the alternative routes were either longer or more dangerous. They set out at dawn, Tom riding his horse while Peterson drove his wagon. Hope trotted alongside, her ears constantly moving as she monitored their surroundings. The first sign of Hope's value came an hour into their journey. She suddenly stopped and began making agitated sounds, pawing at the ground and refusing to move forward. "What's wrong with her?" Peterson asked nervously. Tom dismounted and examined the trail ahead. At first glance, it looked normal, packed earth worn smooth by countless hooves and wheels. But something had spooked Hope, and Tom had learned to trust her instincts. He walked forward carefully, testing each step. 20 feet ahead, his boot broke through what appeared to be solid ground, revealing a sinkhole hidden by a thin crust of dried mud. The hole was deep enough to have broken a horse's leg or overturned Peterson's wagon. "Well, I'll be damned," Peterson breathed when Tom showed him the hidden danger. "How did she know?" Tom couldn't explain it, but he was grateful. They found an alternate route, and the rest of the journey passed without incident. Peterson was so impressed that he paid Tom an extra $2 and promised to recommend his services to other travelers. Word spread quickly. Within a week, Tom had guided 3 more groups safely across difficult terrain, each time with Hope alerting him to dangers that would have been invisible to human senses. Loose rocks that could trigger landslides, patches of quicksand disguised as solid ground, the approach of severe weather, while the sky still looked clear. The money was adding up, but slowly. Tom calculated that at his current rate, he'd earn maybe half of what Martha needed by the deadline. He needed bigger jobs, more dangerous routes that would justify higher fees. That opportunity came in the form of Harrison, the cattle baron, who'd initially mocked Tom's purchase of Hope. Harrison needed someone to guide a valuable herd through territory where rustlers had been active. It was dangerous work that could pay $25 if Tom was willing to risk it. Standing in Martha's kitchen that evening, counting the money he'd earned so far, Tom felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Hope dozed in her stall outside, unaware that their modest success had put them on a path towards something much larger and more dangerous. The foreclosure notice sat on Martha's kitchen table, its deadline looming like a storm cloud. But for the first time since receiving it, Tom felt a glimmer of genuine hope. He and Hope made a good team, and together they might just accomplish what had seemed impossible a month ago. The question was whether 30 days would be enough, and whether Tom's luck would hold when the stakes got higher. The walking stick arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by the youngest Murphy boy, who could barely contain his excitement at being chosen for such an important errand. It was beautifully carved from oak, with intricate patterns that spoke of hours of careful work, and a brass nameplate that simply read, Tom Harlan, with gratitude. "Grandfather made it himself," young Billy Murphy announced proudly. "Took him near 3 weeks, working every evening after supper." Tom accepted the gift with a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. He'd guided the Murphy family, grandfather, parents, and 3 children safely through a treacherous stretch of canyon country 2 weeks earlier, when Hope had detected an unstable rock formation that would have trapped them in a landslide. It had been routine work, the kind he was getting used to, but apparently it had meant more to the Murphys than he'd realized. "You tell your grandfather I'm honored," Tom said, running his fingers over the smooth wood. "This is fine work. He says you and Hope saved our lives," Billy continued. "Says he's never seen anything like how she knew that whole cliff was ready to come down." After the boy left, Tom stood in the stable examining the walking stick. It was more than just a practical tool. It was recognition, proof that his work mattered to people. Hope nuzzled his shoulder, as if she understood the significance of the moment. "Look at that girl," he said softly. "Folks are starting to take notice." The past 2 weeks had brought a steady stream of work. Tom's reputation was spreading along the cattle trails and trade routes, carried by grateful travelers who'd experienced Hope's uncanny abilities firsthand. He'd guided 3 more families safely through dangerous territory, helped a merchant caravan avoid a flash flood that would have destroyed their goods, and even assisted Sheriff Coleman in tracking down cattle thieves who'd thought they could hide in the Badlands. Each success brought more money toward Martha's debt, but also something equally important: respect. People no longer looked at Tom as the unlucky cowboy who'd lost his ranch. They saw him as Tom Harlan, the guide who could get you anywhere safely, the man with the remarkable donkey who seemed to know things no animal should know. $47, Martha said that evening, counting the money Tom had earned. "In just 3 weeks, I never would have believed it possible." They sat at the kitchen table, the foreclosure notice spread before them, alongside Tom's growing pile of earnings. The contrast was stark, the cold, official language of the bank document against the tangible evidence of Tom's success. "It's not enough yet," Tom admitted. "We need nearly 400 more, and there's only a week left." Martha reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The touch was gentle, comforting, and it made Tom's pulse quicken in a way he wasn't quite ready to examine. "You've done more than anyone could have asked," she said. "If we lose this place, it won't be because you didn't try." Tom turned his hand palm up, briefly capturing her fingers before she pulled away. "We're not losing it. I have an idea, but it's risky." Before he could explain, the sound of hooves outside interrupted them. Tom recognized the rider before he dismounted Jake Williams, one of Harrison's ranch hands. Williams was a hard man with suspicious eyes, the kind who'd learned not to trust anyone or anything. "Harlan," Williams called from the porch. "Mr. Harrison wants to see you. Tonight." Tom exchanged glances with Martha. Harrison was the biggest cattle baron in 3 counties, a man whose word carried weight and whose displeasure could ruin a person's prospects permanently. They'd had minimal contact since the incident where Hope had saved Harrison's horse from unstable ground. "What's this about?" Tom asked, stepping outside. Williams shrugged. "Didn't say. Just told me to fetch you and that donkey of yours. Said it was business." The ride to Harrison's ranch took nearly an hour, with Hope trotting steadily beside Tom's horse. The ranch headquarters was impressive, a sprawling adobe house surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and corrals that held some of the finest cattle Tom had ever seen. It represented everything he'd once dreamed of having, before drought and debt had destroyed those dreams. Harrison waited on his front porch, a big man with silver hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. He was dressed in expensive clothes that somehow managed to look practical, and his boots were made of leather, finer than anything Tom had ever owned. "Harlan," Harrison nodded as Tom approached. "Appreciate you coming out." "Mr. Harrison." Tom touched his hat brim respectfully. "William said you wanted to see me about business." "That's right. I've been hearing interesting things about you and that donkey, stories that sound too good to be true, if I'm being honest." Tom felt his jaw tighten. "I don't make claims I can't back up." Harrison studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward Hope. "Mind if I take a closer look at her?" Tom nodded, and Harrison approached the donkey slowly. Hope stood still for his examination, her good eye watchful but calm. Harrison was clearly a man who knew animals. His hands were gentle but sure, as he checked her legs, looked at her teeth, and observed her general condition. "She's in better shape than when you bought her," Harrison observed. "Good care will do that. But I'm more interested in these supposed abilities of hers, such as—" Harrison walked back to the porch and picked up a lantern, "such as whether she can really sense danger the way people claim. I've got a section of range that's been giving me trouble. Cattle keep avoiding it, won't graze there even when the grass is good. Lost 2 head last month, found them at the bottom of a ravine nobody knew was there." Tom began to understand where this was heading. "You want me to survey the area. I want you to tell me what's dangerous about it. If your donkey is as special as people say, she should be able to spot whatever's spooking my cattle. And if she can?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "Then I've got a proposition for you. Big job, good money, enough to solve whatever financial troubles you might be having." The implication was clear. Harrison knew about Martha's foreclosure notice. In a town the size of Dry, well, few secrets stayed secret for long. "What kind of job?" Tom asked. "Cattle drive. 200 head, moving through territory where rustlers have been active. Need someone who can keep the herd safe, avoid trouble before it starts." Harrison paused. "Pays $50, cash." Tom's heart raced. $50 would more than cover what Martha owed, with money left over for a fresh start. But cattle drives through rustler territory were notoriously dangerous, and he'd be responsible not just for his own safety, but for valuable livestock and the men who worked them. "When would this be?" he asked. "Soon as you prove your donkey can do what people claim. Tomorrow, we test her on that problem range. If she passes, we leave the day after." Tom looked down at Hope, who was grazing peacefully nearby. She seemed so small, so unassuming. It was hard to believe that this gentle creature might hold the key to saving Martha's home and securing his own future. "All right," he said finally, "we'll do your test." Harrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Be here at dawn. And Harlan, I hope for your sake the donkey is everything people say she is. Because if she's not, this could go very badly for everyone involved." As Tom rode back toward town, Hope's hooves clicking steadily on the hard-packed trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was gambling with more than just money. Harrison was offering the chance to solve all their problems at once, but the cattle baron was also a man who didn't tolerate failure. The walking stick bounced gently against his saddle, a reminder of the gratitude and respect he'd earned. Tomorrow would determine whether that respect was justified and whether Hope's remarkable abilities were enough to handle whatever dangers Harrison's proposition might bring. Dawn came grey and cold, with the kind of wind that cut through a man's jacket and reminded him that winter wasn't far off. Tom arrived at Harrison's ranch to find the cattle baron already mounted and waiting, along with 2 of his hands. The men looked skeptical, their expressions suggesting they thought this whole exercise was a waste of time. "Morning, Harlan," Harrison called. "Ready to show us what that donkey can do?" Tom nodded, though his stomach was tight with nervous energy. Everything depended on this test: Martha's home, his own future, the reputation he'd been building. Hope seemed to sense his tension. She stayed close to his horse, her ears constantly moving as she monitored their surroundings. They rode north for about an hour, through rolling grassland that gradually gave way to more broken country. The problem area, when they reached it, looked deceptively peaceful. Good grass, scattered trees for shade, a small creek running through the middle. It was exactly the kind of range cattle should love. "Looks fine to me," one of Harrison's hands muttered. "That's what I thought too," Harrison replied, "until I started losing cattle." Tom dismounted and let Hope explore the area freely. She began moving in a systematic pattern, her nose close to the ground, occasionally stopping to test the air or paw at the earth. Tom had learned to read her body language over the past month, and he could see growing agitation in the way she held her ears and the tension in her muscles. 20 yards into the grass, Hope stopped abruptly and began backing away, making low, distressed sounds. "What's she doing?" Harrison asked. Tom approached carefully, studying the ground where Hope had stopped. To his eyes, it looked like solid earth covered with grass, but when he knelt and pressed his hand against it, he felt the surface give slightly. "Sinkhole," he announced. "The ground's undermined here." Harrison dismounted and joined him, pressing his own hand to the earth. "I'll be damned. How deep do you think it goes?" Tom picked up a rock and dropped it into what appeared to be solid ground. They listened as it fell, bouncing off unseen walls, before finally landing with a distant splash. Deep enough to swallow a steer. Hope had moved on, working her way systematically across the range. She found 2 more sinkholes, both hidden beneath seemingly solid grass, and identified a section where underground erosion had created a network of caves that could collapse under the weight of grazing cattle. "No wonder they avoid this place," Harrison said, his skepticism replaced by grudging respect. "Their instincts are better than mine." But Hope wasn't finished. She'd moved to the edge of the creek and was displaying a different kind of agitation, not fear, but alert attention. She pawed at the ground near the water's edge, then looked back at Tom with what he'd learned to recognize as urgent communication. Tom joined her at the creek bank and knelt to examine the area. The water ran clear and shallow, looking perfectly normal, but Hope continued to insist something was wrong. "What is it, girl?" Tom murmured, running his hands through the grass near the water. His fingers found it a thin strand of wire, almost invisible, strung just above the water level. Following the wire carefully, he discovered it was attached to a crude but effective trap, designed to trip animals drinking at the creek. "Rustlers," Harrison said grimly when Tom showed him the wire. "They've been using this place as a trap. Drive cattle here, let them fall into the sinkholes or get tangled in the wire, then come back later to collect whatever they can salvage." Tom felt cold anger settle in his chest. It was one thing to steal cattle outright, that was a straightforward crime. But this was crueler, using the animals' natural needs against them, letting them suffer while the thieves waited safely elsewhere. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. Harrison's expression was grim. "Months, probably. I should have investigated sooner, but I thought it was just bad luck." They spent the rest of the morning documenting the dangers Hope had found, mapping the locations of sinkholes and removing the rustlers' traps. By the time they finished, Harrison's skepticism had completely disappeared. "I owe you an apology, Harlan," he said as they prepared to ride back. "And I owe that donkey more than I can repay. She's probably saved me hundreds of dollars in lost cattle." Tom felt a surge of pride, both in Hope and in himself. "Does this mean you still want us for the cattle drive?" Harrison's smile was genuine for the first time since Tom had known him. "Son, after what I've seen today, I wouldn't trust that herd to anyone else. But I'm increasing the pay to $75. You've earned it." $75. More money than Tom had ever made on a single job, enough to pay off Martha's debt with money left over for improvements to the boarding house. He tried to keep the excitement out of his voice as he accepted the offer. The ride back to town gave Tom time to think about what had just happened. Hope had proven herself beyond any doubt, but she'd also revealed the existence of a deliberate threat to the community. The rustlers weren't just stealing cattle, they were endangering anyone who might use that range. When they reached the boarding house, Tom found Martha in the kitchen, along with an unexpected visitor. A small girl, maybe 8 years old, sat at the table with a wooden toy horse clutched in her hands. Her clothes were travel-worn, and her eyes held the particular wariness of a child who'd seen too much uncertainty. "Tom," Martha said with relief when he entered, "this is Sarah. Her family's wagon broke down about 5 miles out of town. Her father sent her ahead to get help." Tom knelt to the girl's level. "Where's your family now, Sarah?" "Mama's staying with the wagon," the girl said in a small voice. "Papa and my brother went to look for help, but that was yesterday. They said they'd be back by now." Tom exchanged glances with Martha. A broken wagon on the prairie was serious business, especially with weather turning cold and the possibility of rustlers in the area. "I'll get Sheriff Coleman," Tom said. "We'll organize a search party." "No need," Martha said quietly. "I already sent word. Ray's gathering men now. But they could use someone who knows the country." Tom nodded, understanding. This was exactly the kind of situation where Hope's abilities could make the difference between finding the family quickly and searching for days. But it also meant postponing his return to Harrison's ranch, potentially risking the cattle drive job. Looking at Sarah's frightened face, Tom knew there was really no choice to make. The toy horse in her hands reminded him of his own childhood, of the security that came from knowing adults would keep you safe. Someone's family was lost out there, and Hope might be their best chance of getting home. "We'll find them," he promised Sarah, and saw a little of the fear leave her eyes. As Tom prepared to ride out again, Hope already anticipating another journey, he reflected on how much his life had changed. A month ago, he'd been a man without prospects, spending his last $2 on an animal nobody wanted. Now he was someone people turned to in times of trouble, a man whose word carried weight and whose unusual partner could accomplish things that seemed impossible. The toy horse Sarah clutched would become another reminder of why this work mattered, not just for the money, though they desperately needed that, but for the simple human truth that everyone deserved to make it home safely. They found Sarah's family just as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Hope had led them unerringly across seemingly trackless country, following some invisible trail that only she could detect. The broken wagon sat in a shallow depression between two hills, and the relief on the mother's face when she saw her daughter was worth more than any payment Tom had ever received. "Sarah, oh, thank God," the woman cried, sweeping her daughter into her arms. "We were so worried when you didn't come back." The reunion was complete when they located the father and older son, who had been searching in the wrong direction for 2 days. The family's gratitude was overwhelming, but what struck Tom most was the way they treated Hope, not as a curiosity or an oddity, but as a hero who had brought their family back together. Back in town, as Tom counted the money he'd accumulated over the past month, the weight of possibility settled on his shoulders. $137 now, with Harrison's cattle drive promising 75 more. It would be enough, more than enough, to save Martha's boarding house. But sitting in the stable that night, brushing Hope's coat by lamplight, Tom found himself thinking about the faded photograph tucked in his saddlebags. His parents on their wedding day, standing in front of the ranch house his grandfather had built. His father had died, believing his son was a failure, that the family legacy would die with the loss of the ranch. "What do you think, girl?" Tom murmured to Hope. "Think the old man would be proud of what we're doing?" Hope turned her good eye toward him, and for a moment Tom could swear he saw understanding there. Not just animal intelligence, but something deeper, a recognition of the weight he carried, and a gentle reassurance that he wasn't carrying it alone. The next few days brought a steady stream of visitors to the boarding house. Word of Hope's abilities had spread far beyond Drywell, carried by grateful travelers and curious storytellers. People came from 3 counties away just to see the miracle donkey who could detect dangers no human would notice. Tom found himself uncomfortable with the attention. Some visitors wanted to turn Hope into a spectacle, offering money for demonstrations or suggesting he take her on exhibition tours. The idea of putting Hope on display like a circus animal made his stomach turn, but the offers were substantial enough to set him up for life. $50 just to show her abilities in Abilene, one promoter explained. One afternoon, maybe 2 hours of work. People are fascinated by unusual animals. Tom declined politely, but the offers kept coming. Each one represented financial security, the chance to never worry about money again. Each one also felt like a betrayal of the trust Hope placed in him. Martha watched these exchanges with growing concern. "They see her as a commodity," she observed one evening after another promoter had left disappointed. "Not as the remarkable creature she is." "I know," Tom replied, "but the money would come at what cost?" Martha's voice was gentle but firm. "You saved Hope from people who saw only her flaws. Don't hand her over to people who see only her abilities." The conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Coleman's arrival. The lawman looked troubled, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious worry. "Tom, I need to ask a favor," Coleman said without preamble. "Big one. What's wrong?" Coleman settled into his usual chair, accepting coffee from Martha with a grateful nod. "Got word from the territorial marshal? There's been trouble up north, serious trouble. A gang's been hitting ranches, stealing everything they can carry and burning what they can't." Tom felt cold dread settle in his stomach. "How far north?" "Close enough. They hit the Morrison place yesterday, just 40 miles from here. Word is they're moving this direction, looking for easy targets." Martha paled. "Are we in danger?" "Hard to say," Coleman admitted, "but I'm organizing patrols, trying to keep an eye on the surrounding area. Problem is, we're dealing with country I don't know as well as I should. Too many places for trouble to hide." Tom understood what the sheriff was asking. "You want Hope and me to scout ahead of your patrols. If you're willing, I know you've got that cattle drive with Harrison coming up, but this is about protecting our community." Tom looked at Martha, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. The money from Harrison's job would solve their immediate problems, but it wouldn't matter much if the town was burned to the ground while they were gone. "How long do you need?" Tom asked. "Few days, maybe a week, just until we know whether they're really heading this way." Before Tom could answer, Martha spoke up. "Of course he'll help. We all have to do our part." Tom felt a surge of affection for her, mixed with worry about the risks they were taking on. But she was right. This was their community, their home. If they couldn't protect it, what was the point of saving it from the bank? "I'll talk to Harrison, see if we can delay the cattle drive," Tom said. Coleman's relief was visible. "Much obliged. I'll sleep better knowing you and Hope are keeping watch." After the sheriff left, Tom and Martha sat in companionable silence. The foreclosure notice still lay on the table, but somehow it seemed less threatening now. They'd found a way to raise the money, even if it meant taking risks Tom had never contemplated before. "Martha," Tom said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked up from her sewing with patient attention. "These past weeks, working with Hope, building something worthwhile, it's been the best time I've had since losing the ranch. And a big part of that is because of you." Martha's hands stilled on her needlework. "Tom, I know it's not the right time, with everything that's happening, but I wanted you to know. Whatever comes next, I'm grateful for what we've built here." Martha set down her sewing and reached across the table to touch his hand. "I'm grateful too, more than you know." The moment was interrupted by Hope's sharp bray from the stable, followed by the sound of approaching horses. Tom was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Through the window, they could see riders approaching too many for a social call, moving too fast for casual travel. Tom counted at least 6 men, all armed, their faces hidden by the growing darkness. "Get away from the windows," Tom said quietly to Martha, "and stay low." Hope's continued agitation told him everything he needed to know. These weren't travelers seeking shelter for the night. This was trouble of the worst kind, arriving exactly when they were least prepared to handle it. The photograph of his parents seemed to watch him from across the room as Tom checked his rifle and prepared to defend the home that had become more precious to him than any ranch his grandfather had ever built. The riders turned out to be Sheriff Coleman and his hastily assembled posse, their faces grim with news that made Tom's blood run cold. The gang had struck again, hitting 2 more ranches in a single night. They were moving faster than anyone had anticipated, and they were definitely heading toward Dry Well. 3 families dead, Coleman reported, his voice heavy with anger and grief. The Hendersons, the McCalls, and old Pete Garrison. Burned them out after taking everything of value. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The Hendersons had stayed at the boarding house just 2 months ago, a young couple with a baby who'd been looking for land to homestead. The thought of them dying at the hands of murderous thieves made Tom's hands shake with rage. "How many men are we dealing with?" Tom asked, forcing himself to focus on practical matters. "At least a dozen, maybe more. They're well armed, and they know the country." Coleman's badge caught the lamplight as he leaned forward. "Tom, I hate to ask this, but we need every advantage we can get. Hope's abilities might be the only way to track these bastards before they hit us." Tom looked at the sheriff's weathered face, seeing the weight of responsibility there. Coleman was a good man trying to protect his community with limited resources against overwhelming odds. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. "We'll leave at first light," Tom said, "but I want Martha somewhere safe first." "I'm not going anywhere," Martha said firmly. "This is my home too." "The boarding house will be one of their targets," Tom argued. "It's got supplies, money, things they'll want." Martha's jaw set in a way Tom was learning to recognize. "Then we make sure they don't get them. I can handle a rifle as well as most men, and I know every hiding place in this building." Coleman nodded approvingly. "We'll post guards here. Martha won't be alone." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that carried sound for miles. Tom saddled his horse, while Hope waited patiently, as if she understood they were heading into danger. She'd been restless all night, her ears constantly moving, alert to sounds only she could hear. The posse consisted of 8 men, farmers, shopkeepers, and ranch hands who'd volunteered to defend their community. Most weren't experienced fighters, but they had the desperate courage of people protecting their homes and families. Hope led them north, following a trail invisible to human eyes. Tom had learned to trust her completely, but he still marveled at her ability to track people across country that showed no obvious signs of passage. She moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to test the air or examine the ground before continuing with renewed certainty. "How does she do it?" asked Pete Wilson, a young farmer who joined the posse more from duty than confidence. "Wish I knew," Tom replied honestly. "Best I can figure. She picks up on things we miss. Scent, disturbed ground, maybe just the feeling that something's not right." They found the gang's most recent campsite around midday. The ashes were still warm, and the evidence of their presence was brutally clear, scattered belongings from their victims, including a child's doll that made every man in the posse clench his jaw with anger. Hope became increasingly agitated as they examined the camp, pawing at the ground and making low, distressed sounds. Tom dismounted to investigate what had caught her attention. "They split up," he announced after studying the tracks. "Looks like the main group continued north, but 4 or 5 riders broke off and headed east." Coleman frowned. "East would take them toward town." Tom felt ice settle in his stomach. The eastern route would bring the smaller group directly to Drywell, approaching from the blind side, where no one would be watching for them. It was exactly the kind of tactical move that suggested these weren't random raiders, but experienced military men turned criminal. "We need to get back," Tom said urgently. "If they hit the town while we're out here..." "The main group's still a threat," Coleman pointed out. "If we let them get behind us..." Hope solved the dilemma by making her choice clear. She turned toward the east, every line of her body indicating urgent purpose. The danger to Drywell was immediate and real. They rode hard, pushing their horses to the limit across country that would have been treacherous without Hope to guide them. She led them along routes that avoided the worst terrain, but Tom could see the strain on both animals and men. By late afternoon, several horses were beginning to falter. "We need to rest them," Wilson gasped, his face flushed with exhaustion. "No time," Tom replied, though he could see his own horse was struggling. "Hope's telling us we're running out of time." As if to confirm his words, they crested a hill and saw smoke rising in the distance, thin columns that spoke of buildings on fire. The smoke was coming from the direction of Drywell. Coleman cursed with words Tom had never heard the mild-mannered sheriff use. "We're too late." "Maybe not," Tom said, studying the smoke. "Looks like just one or two buildings, if we can get there while they're still in town." Hope was already moving down the hill, her small hooves finding purchase on slopes that would have challenged a mountain goat. The posse followed, abandoning caution for speed, driven by the desperate hope that they might arrive in time to make a difference. The sound of gunfire reached them when they were still 2 miles out, sporadic shots that suggested fighting rather than execution. Someone in Dry Well was putting up resistance, buying precious time with courage and determination. As they topped the final ridge before town, Tom could see the situation clearly. The boarding house was surrounded, but it wasn't burning. Smoke rose from the general store and the church, but the most important buildings were still intact. More importantly, he could see muzzle flashes from the boarding house windows. Martha and whoever was with her were still fighting. "Spread out," Coleman ordered quietly. "We come at them from 3 sides. Tom, you and Hope find the best approach." Hope had already chosen their route, leading Tom down a dry creek bed that would bring them to within 50 yards of the boarding house. As they moved into position, Tom felt the weight of everything that mattered to him, balanced on the next few minutes. The photograph of his parents seemed to hover in his mind, along with Martha's face and the memory of all the people who'd come to trust him and Hope. Whatever happened next would determine not just whether they saved the town, but whether the life he'd built was worth the sacrifices that had made it possible. Sheriff Coleman's badge glinted in the afternoon sun as he gave the signal to attack, and Tom spurred his horse forward with Hope running alongside, both of them racing toward a confrontation that would test everything they'd learned about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of home. The attack was perfectly coordinated, striking from 3 directions simultaneously. Tom watched from the creek bed as Coleman's men engaged the raiders surrounding the boarding house, their rifles cracking in the afternoon air. The bandits, caught by surprise, scrambled for cover behind wagons and water troughs. But something felt wrong. Hope sensed it too, her ears flattening against her head as she pawed nervously at the ground. The raiders were fighting, but not with the desperate fury of men caught in a trap. Their movements were too controlled, too organized, as if they'd been expecting this exact scenario. Tom raised his rifle and took careful aim at one of the men near the boarding house steps. The shot was clean, dropping the raider instantly, but as the man fell, his hat came off, revealing features that made Tom's blood freeze. Jake Williams, Harrison's own ranch hand, the man who delivered the invitation to test Hope just days ago. The pieces clicked together in Tom's mind with sickening clarity. Harrison hadn't been offering him a legitimate cattle drive. He'd been positioning Tom and Hope away from town during the raid. The cattle baron, everyone respected, the man whose word carried weight throughout 3 counties, was the leader of the gang that had been terrorizing the territory. Tom's second shot went wide as the implications hit him. Harrison knew about Martha's foreclosure notice because he'd arranged for the bank to accelerate the timeline. He'd probably been buying up distressed properties throughout the region, using fear and violence to drive down prices before swooping in as the wealthy savior. "Coleman!" Tom shouted across the gunfire. "It's a setup. Harrison's behind this." The sheriff couldn't hear him over the noise of battle, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Hope had led them into exactly the trap Harrison had prepared. The raiders were fighting a delaying action, keeping the posse occupied, while the main force, Harrison's real team, approached Dry Well from another direction entirely. Hope's agitation suddenly made sense. She wasn't sensing the danger from the men they were fighting. She was detecting the approach of the larger threat. The smoke from the burning buildings wasn't random destruction. It was a signal to coordinate the final assault. Tom made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation he possessed. Instead of continuing the fight against Williams and his men, he turned Hope toward the hills behind town, following her urgent guidance toward whatever larger danger she'd detected. They crested the ridge just as Harrison's main force came into view, 12 men armed with military precision, moving toward Dry Well with the confidence of soldiers who'd never known defeat. At their head rode Harrison himself, no longer the respectable cattle baron, but revealed as the predator he'd always been. The sight that made Tom's stomach lurch was the dynamite strapped to pack horses in the center of the group. Harrison wasn't planning to loot Dry Well, he was planning to destroy it completely, making sure no witnesses remained to connect him to the raids that had terrorized the territory. Tom had perhaps 10 minutes before Harrison's force reached the town. 10 minutes to warn people, to organize a defense against overwhelming odds, to somehow prevent the complete destruction of everything he'd come to care about. But Hope had other ideas. Instead of leading him back toward town, she struck out across country toward the old mining claims that honeycomb the hills east of Dry Well. Tom trusted her judgment implicitly by now, but he couldn't understand what she was thinking. "Come on, girl," he muttered. "Whatever you've got in mind, make it fast." Hope led him to an abandoned mine shaft that Tom had never paid much attention to before. But as they approached, he could see why she'd brought him here. The shaft opened directly onto the trail Harrison's men would use to approach town. More importantly, the timber supports looked rotten, ready to collapse at the slightest disturbance. Tom dismounted and examined the mine entrance more carefully. The whole hillside was riddled with old workings, connected by tunnels that hadn't been properly sealed when the miners moved on. If he could trigger a collapse in the right place. The sound of approaching hooves gave him perhaps 3 minutes to work. Tom pulled the small charges he always carried for clearing rock slides from his saddlebags, setting them quickly against the weakest support timbers. It wasn't much explosive, but it didn't need to be. The mine was ready to come down on its own. It just needed encouragement. Hope watched his preparations with what seemed like approval, her good eye tracking his movements as he ran the fuses and prepared to light them. When Harrison's men came around the bend, Tom would have one chance to time this perfectly. The first rider appeared just as Tom struck his match. Harrison himself, sitting tall in his saddle with the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged. Behind him came his gang, the pack horses with their deadly cargo, and the certain destruction of everything Tom held dear. Tom lit the fuses and ran for cover, pulling Hope behind a boulder just as the first charges detonated. The sound was muffled at first, more of a rumble than an explosion, but then the hillside began to move. The mine collapse was spectacular and terrible. Tons of rock and timber crashed down onto the trail, burying Harrison's men under an avalanche that had been building pressure for decades. The dynamite on the pack horses added its own contribution to the destruction, turning what might have been a partial blockade into complete devastation. When the dust settled, there was no trail, no Harrison, no gang, just a new configuration of the hillside that would puzzle geologists for years to come. Tom sat in the sudden silence, his ears ringing from the explosions, trying to process what had just happened. Hope nuzzled his shoulder gently, as if to remind him that they weren't finished yet. Down in Dry Well, Coleman and his men were still fighting Williams and the decoy force, unaware that the real threat had been eliminated. The ride back to town felt like a dream. Tom arrived to find the battle winding down, the surviving raiders either dead or surrendering in the face of superior numbers. Coleman looked up as Tom approached, his face grim with the aftermath of violence. "Where the hell did you go?" the sheriff demanded. "And what was that rumbling sound?" Tom dismounted slowly, still not quite believing what he and Hope had accomplished. "Harrison's dead, his whole gang. They were planning to blow up the town." Coleman stared at him. "Harrison, what are you talking about?" He was behind all of it. The raids, the murders, probably the bank accelerating Martha's foreclosure. He wanted to buy up the whole territory cheap, and he was willing to kill anyone who got in his way. The explanation took nearly an hour, with Tom describing everything he'd observed and deduced. Coleman listened with growing amazement and anger, occasionally asking questions that confirmed Tom's theory. "Son of a bitch," the sheriff said finally. "No wonder we could never get ahead of them. They had inside information on everything who had money, which ranches were isolated, when shipments were coming through. Martha emerged from the boarding house as they were talking, her face pale but determined. She'd been defending her home with the help of Dr. Hayes and 2 traveling salesmen who'd happened to be staying there. The building showed bullet scars, but it was intact. "Is it over?" she asked, looking between Tom and Coleman. Tom nodded, suddenly exhausted. "It's over. All of it." Martha's eyes filled with tears of relief, but before she could respond, Coleman spoke up with a grim smile. "Tom, I don't know how to thank you. What you and Hope did today, saving the whole town." "There's no need," Tom interrupted. "This is our home." But even as he said it, Tom was thinking about the implications of Harrison's death. The cattle baron had been the most powerful man in 3 counties, with business interests and debts that would take months to sort out. His ranch, his cattle, his land holdings, all of it would need new ownership. And somewhere in Harrison's papers, Tom was willing to bet they'd find evidence that the bank had been pressured to accelerate Martha's foreclosure as part of a larger scheme to acquire properties throughout the region. The foreclosure notice that had started this whole adventure might turn out to be the least of their worries after all. In the 3 days following Harrison's death, Drywell transformed from a sleepy cattle town into the center of a territorial investigation that drew lawmen, lawyers, and land speculators from as far away as Austin. The truth about Harrison's criminal enterprise unfolded like layers of an onion, each revelation more shocking than the last. Tom found himself at the center of it all, his actions having triggered an avalanche of consequences that went far beyond saving one small town. The territorial marshal, a stern man named Garrison, who wore his authority like an expensive suit, had arrived with a team of investigators and enough legal documents to choke a horse. "Mr. Harlan," Marshal Garrison said, settling into Martha's kitchen with the air of a man conducting official business, "you've stumbled onto something considerably larger than cattle rustling." Tom glanced at his father's rifle, now leaning against the wall where he'd placed it after the battle. The weapon had belonged to 3 generations of Harlan men, and Tom felt the weight of that legacy as he faced questions that could reshape the entire territory. "How large?" he asked. Garrison spread papers across Martha's table maps, property deeds, bank documents that painted a picture of systematic corruption. Harrison owned pieces of 7 banks, had partnerships with land speculators in 3 states, and was coordinating with criminal gangs across half of Texas. The raids weren't random violence, they were part of a business plan. Martha brought coffee with hands that trembled slightly. The past few days had taken their toll on everyone, but she'd borne the additional burden of housing investigators, feeding a constant stream of officials, and dealing with reporters who'd heard about the miracle donkey and wanted to sensationalize the story. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends partly on Mr. Harlan," Garrison replied, accepting his coffee with a nod of thanks. "Harrison's estate is worth approximately $200,000. His criminal activities void most of his legitimate business contracts, which means that money has to go somewhere." Tom felt his pulse quicken. $200,000 was a sum beyond his comprehension, enough to buy half the county and still have money left over. "The territorial government takes a percentage," Garrison continued, "but there's provision in the law for rewarding citizens who expose major criminal enterprises. Your actions saved dozens of lives and prevented what could have been years of continued violence." "How much?" Tom asked quietly. $25,000, plus first option to purchase Harrison's ranch at assessed value, which is considerably below market price given the circumstances. The numbers hung in the air like smoke. $25,000 was enough to secure Tom's future permanently, to buy land and cattle, and build the kind of operation his father had dreamed of. Harrison's ranch was prime territory, well-watered and perfectly positioned for cattle operations. But Martha was watching his face, and Tom could see the question in her eyes. $25,000 could also take him anywhere he wanted to go, set him up in California or Colorado, or any of the places where a man could start fresh without the memories of failure and loss. There's one complication, Garrison added carefully. Harrison's operation extended beyond the territorial boundaries. We've identified connected criminal activities in New Mexico and Indian Territory. The federal government wants your cooperation in tracking down the remaining elements of his organization. Tom frowned. What kind of cooperation? You and your donkey have proven exceptionally effective at following trails others can't see. The federal marshals would like to employ your services in hunting down Harrison's surviving associates. The offer was both flattering and terrifying. Tom had never imagined himself as a federal lawman, tracking dangerous criminals across multiple territories. But Hope's abilities had proven invaluable in ways he was still learning to understand. How long would that take? Martha asked, and Tom could hear the carefully controlled emotion in her voice. Months, possibly years, Garrison admitted. These networks don't collapse overnight, but the pay would be substantial federal wages plus bounties on confirmed captures. Tom looked around Martha's kitchen, taking in the details that had become precious to him over the past months. The scarred wooden table where they'd counted his earnings, the blue enamel coffee pot that Martha used every morning, the window that looked out toward Hope's stable. This place had become home in a way the family ranch never quite had, perhaps because he'd chosen it rather than inheriting it. I need time to think, Tom said finally. Garrison nodded. Of course, but don't take too long. Harrison's associates know what happened here, and they won't wait indefinitely before trying to eliminate the threat you represent. After the marshal left, Tom and Martha sat in silence that stretched like a bridge across an uncertain future. Outside, Hope grazed peacefully in the small paddock Tom had built for her, unaware that her remarkable abilities had attracted attention from the highest levels of territorial and federal government. You have to take it, Martha said quietly. The federal job, I mean. Tom looked at her with surprise. Why? Because you'd spend the rest of your life wondering what you might have accomplished. And because, she paused, seeming to gather courage for difficult words. Because I can't ask you to stay for me. The honesty in her voice cut deeper than any criticism could have. Tom reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work and the strength that had helped her survive loss and uncertainty. What if I'm not staying for you? He asked. What if I'm staying because this is where I belong? Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull her hand away. Is it? Really? Or are you settling for what's safe, instead of reaching for what could be extraordinary? The question hung between them like a challenge. Tom had spent most of his adult life playing it safe, taking the prudent course, trying to preserve what little he had, rather than risking it for something greater. It was that same caution that had cost him his father's ranch, and nearly cost him his self-respect. What about the boarding house? He asked. The foreclosure is solved? Martha finished. Between your reward money and the revelation that the bank was pressured by Harrison's people, my debt's been forgiven entirely. I don't need saving anymore, Tom. The question is what you need. That evening, Tom walked out to Hope's paddock and leaned against the fence, watching her graze in the fading light. She looked up at his approach, her good eye reflecting the last rays of the sun, and moved closer to nuzzle his shoulder. What do you think, girl? He asked softly. Ready for another adventure? Hope's response was a gentle whicker that could have meant anything, but Tom found himself thinking about the children they'd saved, the families they'd reunited, the criminals they'd stopped. If Harrison's organization was as extensive as the marshal claimed, there were people throughout the territory living in fear, waiting for help that might never come. Dr. Hayes found him there an hour later, the physician carrying his black bag and wearing the expression of a man with something important to say. Tom, Hayes said, settling against the fence beside him, I wanted to talk to you before you make your decision about Marshal Garrison's offer. What about? Hayes was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. In my profession, I see a lot of people who've given up on themselves. Men who've decided they're not worth saving, that their best days are behind them. You were heading down that road when you bought hope. Tom nodded, remembering the despair that had driven him to spend his last $2 on an animal nobody else wanted. But I've also seen what happens when people discover they have value they never suspected, Hayes continued. You've become someone this community depends on, someone who makes a difference in ways that matter. The question is whether you're ready to accept that responsibility on a larger scale. And if I'm not? If I fail? Hayes smiled. Then you fail attempting something worthwhile. That's considerably better than succeeding at something meaningless. As Tom prepared for bed that night, he found himself holding his father's photograph, studying the faces of people who'd built something lasting from nothing but determination and hope. His father had died, thinking his son was a failure. But Tom was beginning to understand that success wasn't measured by the preservation of what came before. It was measured by the willingness to build something new when the old foundations crumbled. Tomorrow he would give Marshal Garrison his answer, and Hope would either settle into a comfortable life as the town's beloved mascot, or embark on a journey that could take them anywhere in the American West. The choice felt impossibly large, but as Tom listened to Hope's quiet breathing from the stable, he realized that the decision had been made the moment he'd raised his hand at that auction and seen something worth saving in a discarded animal with a sack over her head. Some choices were about preserving what you had. Others were about discovering what you could become. Tom was finally ready to find out which kind of man he really was. Tom found Marshal Garrison at dawn, standing beside his horse in front of the hotel with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting for important decisions. The marshal's badge caught the early light, polished silver that spoke of federal authority and the weight of justice that stretched across territorial boundaries. "Marshal," Tom said, approaching with Hope at his side, "I've made my decision." Garrison turned, his experienced eyes taking in Tom's expression and finding whatever answer he'd been looking for. "And? We'll do it. Hope and I will help you track down Harrison's associates." The marshal nodded with satisfaction, but his expression remained serious. "I'm glad to hear it, because we've had developments overnight that make your assistance even more critical." Tom felt a chill of apprehension. "What kind of developments?" Garrison pulled a telegram from his jacket pocket. Harrison had a partner, man named Corcoran, operates out of New Mexico territory. Word of Harrison's death reached him yesterday, and he's not taking it well. Tom read the telegram over Garrison's shoulder, the official language doing little to soften the brutal message. Corcoran's gang hit 3 ranches last night, killed everyone they found. This is retaliation, pure and simple. "How many men?" Tom asked. "At least 20, possibly more. They're well armed, well organized, and they know this country. More importantly, they know about you." The last statement hit Tom like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Garrison's expression was grim. One of the ranchers survived long enough to tell the local sheriff what he'd heard. Corcoran's men were asking questions about the man with the donkey who'd brought down Harrison. "They're not just looking for revenge, they're hunting you specifically." Tom looked down at Hope, who was grazing peacefully beside the hotel hitching post, unaware that her remarkable abilities had made her a target for some of the most dangerous men in the territory. The thought of these killers tracking her down filled him with cold rage. "Where are they now?" he asked. "Last seen heading north toward the territorial border. But Corcoran's smart, he won't make the same mistakes Harrison did. He'll be expecting us to follow, and he'll have planned accordingly." Tom thought about the implications. Corcoran would know about Hope's tracking abilities, which meant he'd take steps to confuse or eliminate their trail. Worse, he'd probably set traps, using his knowledge of their capabilities against them. "How many men can you field?" Tom asked. 12 federal marshals, plus whatever local support we can arrange. Not enough for a direct confrontation, but sufficient for careful pursuit. Tom nodded, his mind already working through the tactical problems they'd face. "When do we leave?" "Within the hour. Corcoran's got a lead on us, and every minute we wait gives him more time to prepare. Martha appeared in the hotel doorway as they were making final preparations, her face pale but determined. She'd dressed for travel, with a practical riding outfit and a small bag over her shoulder. "I'm coming with you," she announced. Tom stared at her. "Absolutely not. This is too dangerous." "These men killed families," Martha interrupted, "women and children who were just trying to build lives for themselves. I won't sit safely in dry well while you risk everything to stop them." Garrison looked between them with the expression of a man who'd witnessed this particular argument many times before. "Ma'am, I appreciate your courage, but this is federal business. We can't be responsible for civilian safety." Martha's jaw set in the stubborn line Tom had learned to recognize. "Then don't be responsible for me. I'll follow on my own if I have to, but I'm not staying behind." Tom felt torn between admiration for her courage and terror at the thought of her facing the kind of men who'd murdered entire families for revenge. But he also recognized the determination in her voice, the same quality that had helped her survive her husband's death and fight to keep the boarding house. "She's safer with us than following alone," he said finally to Garrison. "And we might need someone who can tend wounds or handle supplies." The marshal considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Your responsibility, Harlan, but she follows orders without question, and if things go bad, she gets out of the way." Martha smiled with grim satisfaction. "Understood." As they prepared to ride out, Tom found himself looking back at Drywell with mixed emotions. The town that had seemed like a dead end just months ago had become home, the place where he'd discovered his true capabilities and found people worth fighting for. Now he was leaving it behind to face dangers that could easily claim his life. Hope seemed to sense the gravity of their mission. She stood alert and ready, her ears constantly moving as she monitored their surroundings. The little donkey who'd been mocked and discarded was now the key to hunting down some of the most dangerous criminals in the territory. "Ready?" Garrison asked, swinging into his saddle. Tom mounted his horse and looked at Martha, who sat her own horse with the competence of someone who'd grown up on the frontier. Hope positioned herself at his side, prepared for whatever lay ahead. "Ready," Tom replied, and they rode north toward a confrontation that would test everything they'd learned about courage, justice, and the price of protecting what mattered most. They caught up with Corcoran's gang 3 days later in broken country near the territorial border, where ancient mesas rose like monuments to forgotten civilizations. Hope had led them across terrain that would have baffled experienced trackers, following signs that existed only in her extraordinary senses. The confrontation came at dawn, when the light was soft and deceptive, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red that made the violence seem almost unreal. Tom crouched behind a boulder with Martha beside him, watching Garrison's marshals move into position around Corcoran's camp. Hope lay pressed against the ground nearby, her body tense with the awareness of danger. She'd guided them to this moment with unerring accuracy, but now the success of their mission depended on human courage and federal justice. 23 men, Garrison whispered, returning from his reconnaissance. "Better armed than we expected, and they've chosen their ground well." Tom studied the camp through his field glasses. Corcoran had positioned his men in a natural fortress of rock formations, with clear fields of fire in every direction. A direct assault would be suicide, but there was no way to surround them completely with only 12 marshals. "We need to draw them out," Tom said. "Get them away from their defenses." Garrison nodded grimly. "My thinking exactly. Question is how?" The answer came from Hope herself. The little donkey had been studying the terrain with the same intensity Tom was using, and now she moved toward him with the purposeful manner that meant she'd identified something important. Tom followed her to a position where he could see the back of Corcoran's camp. What Hope had spotted was invisible to human eyes, a narrow passage between rock formations that would allow a small force to approach the gang's position from behind. "It's barely wide enough for one person," Tom observed, tracing the route with his eyes. "And it looks treacherous." But it was their only chance. The passage would allow someone to reach the back of the camp undetected, creating the distraction needed for Garrison's men to attack from the front. "I'll take it," Tom said. "No," Martha said firmly. "You're needed here with Hope to coordinate the attack. I'll go." Tom stared at her. "That's insane. You're not a lawman." "I'm someone those men will underestimate," Martha replied calmly. "And I'm small enough to navigate that passage without being seen." Garrison looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of sending a civilian into such danger. But tactical necessity overrode personal feelings, and Martha's plan had merit. "What exactly are you proposing?" the marshal asked. Martha's smile was grim but determined. "I create enough noise and confusion to draw their attention. You hit them from the front while they're distracted. Simple. And incredibly dangerous," Tom pointed out. "Everything we're doing is dangerous," Martha replied. "But those men murdered children, Tom. Someone has to make them pay for that." In the end, they had little choice. Garrison's marshals were outnumbered nearly 2-1, and a frontal assault without diversion would likely fail. Martha's plan offered their best chance of success, despite the personal risk. Tom watched her disappear into the narrow passage, with his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the upcoming battle. She moved with careful precision, testing each step before committing her weight, gradually working her way around the natural fortress where Corcoran's men waited. Hope seemed to understand what was happening. She positioned herself where she could observe both Martha's progress and the main camp, her ears constantly moving as she monitored sounds from multiple directions. The signal came in the form of gunfire. From the back of the camp, Martha had reached her position and opened fire on the gang's rear guard. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Corcoran's men spun toward the unexpected threat, abandoning their prepared positions to deal with what they assumed was a flanking attack. "Now!" Garrison shouted, and 12 federal marshals rose from concealment with rifles blazing. The battle was fierce but brief. Caught between two fires and deprived of their defensive advantages, Corcoran's gang fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they were doomed. Some tried to surrender, but others chose to go down fighting rather than face federal justice. Tom found himself in the middle of the action, his rifle speaking with mechanical precision as he provided covering fire for the advancing marshals. Hope stayed close beside him, somehow managing to avoid the flying bullets while keeping him informed of threats he couldn't see. The end came when Corcoran himself fell, shot through the chest while trying to rally his remaining men. With their leader dead and their position hopeless, the surviving gang members threw down their weapons and raised their hands. In the sudden silence that followed, Tom's first thought was for Martha. He ran toward the passage where she'd disappeared, Hope trotting alongside, both of them desperate to confirm that she'd survived the battle. They found her sitting against a rock wall, pale but uninjured, her rifle across her knees and a look of grim satisfaction on her face. The sight of her alive and whole made Tom's knees weak with relief. "Is it over?" she asked as he reached her. Tom looked back toward the camp, where Garrison's marshals were securing prisoners and counting the dead. The immediate threat was ended, but the larger implications of what they'd accomplished were just beginning to sink in. "It's over," he confirmed, and helped her to her feet as the town bell of justice rang across the territorial wilderness. 6 months later, Tom stood on the front porch of his new ranch house, watching Hope graze peacefully in the pasture that stretched toward the horizon. The land deed was framed and hanging in his study, legal proof that Tom Harlan owned the finest spread in 3 counties, purchased with the reward money from breaking up Harrison's criminal empire. But the real treasure wasn't the land or the cattle or even the substantial bank account that ensured he'd never want for anything again. The real treasure was the woman who emerged from the house behind him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the simple gold ring that marked her as his wife. "Penny for your thoughts," Martha said, settling beside him on the porch swing he'd built with his own hands. Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, breathing in the rich aroma, along with the scent of prairie grass and the subtle perfume Martha always wore. Just thinking about how different things are from a year ago. Martha followed his gaze to where Hope was teaching a young colt the finer points of finding the sweetest grass. The little donkey had become something of a legend throughout the territory, but she seemed content with her role as mentor to the growing collection of animals that called the ranch home. "Do you miss it?" Martha asked. "The excitement, the federal work?" Tom considered the question seriously. He'd spent 3 months as a federal marshal after the Corcoran affair, helping to track down the remaining elements of Harrison's network. The work had been satisfying in its way, bringing justice to men who preyed on innocent families, but it had also been dangerous and lonely, taking him away from the things that mattered most. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not enough to go back to it." The decision to retire from federal service had been easier than he'd expected. Marshal Garrison had understood, even offered to recommend Tom for a permanent position with better pay and more prestige. But Tom had learned that prestige meant little compared to the satisfaction of building something lasting with your own hands. The ranch was thriving beyond his wildest expectations. The combination of excellent land, good water, and Tom's growing reputation had attracted buyers from across Texas and beyond. More importantly, it had become a gathering place for the community, a symbol of what could be accomplished when good people work together. "Sheriff Coleman stopped by while you were checking the south pasture," Martha said. "He wanted to let you know that Jake Williams was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison." Tom nodded with satisfaction. Williams had been the last of Harrison's original gang to face trial, and his conviction closed the final chapter on that dark period. "Good. Maybe now folks can stop looking over their shoulders." The sound of approaching hooves interrupted their conversation. A familiar figure rode up the drive, Dr. Hayes, looking every inch the prosperous physician in his black suit and silver-headed cane. But his expression was troubled as he dismounted and climbed the porch steps. "Doctor," Martha said, rising to greet him, "what brings you out here?" Hayes accepted a chair with grateful thanks, mopping his brow despite the mild weather. "I'm afraid I have a request, Tom, one I hate to make, given how much you and Martha deserve your peace." Tom felt a familiar tightness in his stomach. "What kind of request?" "There's been trouble up in Colorado Territory, mining disputes that have turned violent, with families caught in the middle. The territorial governor has asked specifically for you, and hope word of your abilities has spread that far." Tom looked at Martha, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. They'd built a good life here, a safe life, surrounded by people who cared about them. The idea of leaving it behind to face unknown dangers in unfamiliar territory held little appeal. "I'm not a lawman anymore, Doc," Tom said carefully. "I'm a rancher." Hayes nodded understandingly. "I know. And I told them you'd probably say exactly that. But Tom, there are children involved. Families who've done nothing wrong except try to make an honest living in dangerous country." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Tom had learned about himself over the past year. He thought about Sarah, the little girl who'd clutched her wooden horse while worrying about her lost family. He thought about all the people Hope had helped save, all the lives that had been preserved by their partnership. "How long?" Martha asked quietly. Hayes looked surprised. "You'd consider it. We'd consider it," Martha replied, taking Tom's hand. "Together." Tom squeezed her fingers, feeling the calluses that spoke of shared work and the strength that had carried them through every challenge they'd faced. "How long?" he repeated. "A few months, probably no more. The territorial government is offering substantial compensation, enough to expand your operation here considerably." Tom stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the land that represented everything he'd ever wanted. Hope raised her head from her grazing and looked back at him, as if sensing the weight of the decision he was facing. But as he watched, a young foal stumbled in the tall grass, and Hope immediately moved to help, nuzzling the little animal back to its feet with gentle patience. It was the same instinct that had driven her to warn him about dangers, to guide lost families home, to stand beside him when facing impossible odds. Some gifts weren't meant to be hoarded. Some abilities carried the responsibility to use them for others, regardless of personal cost or comfort. "We'll do it," Tom said, turning back to Hayes. "But this time we go as a team, all three of us." Martha's smile was radiant with pride and love. Hope nickered softly from the pasture, as if approving of the decision. And Tom felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had guided him from that first moment when he'd seen something worth saving in a donkey with a sack over her head. The land deed on his study wall would still be there when they returned. But some treasures could only be earned by giving them away, and Tom Harlan had finally learned the difference between owning something and truly possessing it. As evening settled over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tom counted his real wealth: a woman who loved him, an animal who trusted him, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new chances to make a difference in the world.